Hey, without further ado, Chris Keathley, everybody.
So yes, my name's Chris. Some of y'all, it's a weird flex. Some of y'all might know me already. I used to do things like this. Nowadays I do things like this. This is what crippling depression looks like. It's really bad. You can actually see. I was like, I took a vacation right there, just for a moment. Yeah, it's wild. I look back on this and I just wonder like what I was thinking in my life at the time. So this is what I used to do. Yeah, it was a rough day. That was a long day. Um, I actually think that might have been my wife's birthday. I think that empty space is like that week. And this was right in the middle of pandemic and quarantine stuff too. So anyway, so I guess what I'm saying is when you look at this and you look at what I was doing in 2020, I think what you could glean from that is I have real healthy avoidance problems. But these days I do this kind of thing. I don't know if you can tell what subreddit this is on, but this is what is this thing? It's a thing I work on. That's the answer. So yeah, I work on this thing, not the boat, sorry. Just very specifically, the thing on top of the boat. I specifically work for a company focused on climate change, and we're trying to build renewable energy devices that go out into the ocean and try to harvest wave energy power in the ocean. It's a fun and quite difficult problem. I don't know how many people have experience like with salt water. Yeah, you all get it. Salt water destroys things. And so it's a real fun set of challenges. And it's cool because like, it's a bunch of steel and stuff. And when I'm like, yeah, I work with the metal, I can look at all those rust people and be like, you got nothing on me. You think your metal's cool? How many thousands of tons is it? Did it go on a barge? And at this company, I'm a principal engineer. And it's in quotes because I don't really ever think of myself like this. Like I'm a failed art student and I'm the equivalent of like 3 dogs in a trench coat pretending to be a programmer for the most part. And so especially when you start throwing around words like engineer, I'm like, that's scary. Those people do math and stuff and know what Fourier transforms are. This has actually been like kind of a journey for me because in this role, I've been thinking a lot over the past couple years of doing this work and what it means to do this work. Like, what does it mean? Oh God, now that I'm saying it all out, I'm realizing it's an existential crisis. I've been realizing more and more, or at least thinking about more and more, what it is that I want to do with my life. Like, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? Like, what is it the problems that I'm actually trying to solve? And when I'm thinking about these things, it's like, it used to be really simple. Like, I could just do the code. I could just like focus on the problems at hand. And a lot of my life, when I was dealing with this sort of stuff, I would like have this big boulder called the work that I needed to do. And a lot of the direct output of the thing that I was doing on a daily basis was like applying force to the other end of the lever and trying to lift the work. And it was great because I could sort of see the outcome of my investment of like how much effort I could apply to this thing. And I could get better levers and I could like find new tools and figure out better ways to heave this work up. And so transitioning out of this sort of view where I feel like my work is the force applied to the lever, and instead realizing my actual job is to be the lever has been really interesting and sort of tricky. When I think about this, I think part of the complexity of working out what it is to be a lever for other people and to empower other people to do their job well, and to be a tool that others can use, I think this gets really hard because it feels to me that we really don't have good ways to like learn that stuff. We actually really don't have, maybe there is good tutelage out there and I'm just naive to it. But I have not found good tutelage that you can like, in the same way that you can learn about the philosophy of software design, say, or how Haskell works, or how types are done, or whatever, like some sort of code thing. And in some ways, the code thing is fun. And also, like, I'm not here to denigrate that. Like, it's like meaningful. We want to care about, you know, how we put things together, how we structure things, how we think about code design. And I've talked about that stuff before. I love that part of the job. But there's a lot of knowledge about how to do that exists in the world, and we can kind of get a sense of it. And to some degree, I think we can also fixate on it because it's a thing within our control. We can hold it. And hey, I can take the lines in this function and I can move them to other functions, and at the end of the day, I can feel like I did something, even though I didn't. And it feels really good. It feels good to sort of like repaint the room. And maybe the room now looks nicer. But I think what I'm attracted to is, at this point in my life, is something sort of that lives above that. Like these higher level concepts or these bigger ideas, because they're way harder. Dealing with things that live above code is a much, much, much harder proposition. They're much more nuanced and much more situational, and there's no rules or rubrics to any of it. Those are the challenges that I'm sort of thinking about on a regular basis. And it's all stuff like this. It's like, these are just off the cuff, a handful of responsibilities that I think I could squarely sort of take action on. And certainly part of it's literally just code, just working on a problem, trying to solve the problem. That part of it, that's just part of the job, and there's an expectation. There's like this architecture thing where you're sort of also trying to solve higher level problems, or as we'll talk about, trying not to solve higher level problems. You're worried about training other people. How do you like get everybody else up to speed? You're about safety. And by safety, I mean literally like, could this kill somebody? It's a lot of steel, right? Well, how does that happen? What are the mechanisms that we use to protect each other, ourselves? And you can extend that to be all kinds of things, right? Like, how do we ensure, if you work in healthcare, how do I ensure my patient's data is not getting out of the database, you know, to anyone else? How do I make sure that this is secure and safe for the users of it? How do I cause no harm in the world by doing this? And along with that is ethics. Like, should we be doing this? Is this a good solution? Like, these are things I think need to be grappled with before we like move forward. And then you also are empowered, or not empowered, but you sort of also required to help solve relationships a little bit. Like, build those relationships with your other team members, like establish them, cultivate them, grow them, create culture. Like, that becomes part of the role. That's tough. That's really, really, really tough. So what I really would like to talk about is what it means to me to be sort of the principal engineer, or a principal engineer. And I think about this in terms of a number of principles, because these are all things that I say, and people thought they were funny quotes. And so as I like go through these, I won't say that these are like the best ideas. I won't say this will make you a really great engineer, or a really great principal engineer, or a really great anything. I'm not sure if this works. These are just the things that I do, and I'm hoping to get a little bit better at this as I go. Remember, 3 dogs in a trench coat. Just trying to figure this out. So these are the big ideas that I want to talk about, and we'll start right here at the top, which is learning how to play ball. So it is a cold, hard reality that many of us have probably grappled with, But unfortunately, life does not conform to your software lifecycle. And actually, here we go, because I'm required to do at least one hot take. Software and software development has been corrupted by the appropriation of Agile by business bros and product managers. They took an otherwise reasonable idea and they changed it and morphed it to their own ends and they sold it back to us and you all bought it. We have to be better than this. Because like the stuff in Agile is fine, but so I run a little bit and I've never thought towards the end of the run when I'm really, really tired, I know how I can get more energy out of this. I'll just fire the gun again and just start running again, AKA sprints. The fact of the matter is your companies, people you work with, your teams, all of that stuff is all based on the real world and does not conform to the things that we would obviously like to do. It's not going to read the XP Explain book and go, yep, that's it, unless you're a consultancy and then you get to do that. If you're not, that's just not your reality. And you want to know a little thing about my reality? This is my reality. Y'all know what this is? Yeah, that's a Gantt chart. I think it's funny that they called it a Grant chart because I think it's supposed to be like a pun or something. I got this off Google Images. I don't know. Not appropriate, definitely just stolen. Can't get money off this talk. But this is like literally how our reality works. We have steel that needs to be welded and shipped. That has to be there on time. We got shipping delays. And if you're not there on time, you're potentially costing lots of sums of money to get a thing out the door. There's a deployment window. There's a storm coming in our deployment region. What are we going to do about that? These are complicated things. That's a reality. And I think part of the process of sort of growing in this field is realizing that that's fine. I can still make good software and embrace some of these iterative ideas and conform into this. Part of this is learning how to play ball. You got to play ball with the rest of the company, with the rest of the organization. If this is how people want to see their stuff, you can't then turn around and be like, well, actually, I don't do timelines. My points don't account for that, or whatever. That doesn't play ball. You got to play ball. Similarly, playing ball means not being so tied to your choices or your favorite thing or your technology or the way you want to do it that you go against what everything else is going on in the company. And because the fact of the matter is, it doesn't really matter all that much. I had a professor in school, he loved to say this. He said, if you give me a big enough engine, I can make this building fly. And I don't know what he thought he meant by that to this day. But I think what he meant was that if you're on a software team and they all choose to do whatever technology and they're making it work and you all care about it and they're willing just to put the energy into it, then you can make the building fly. You can make the thing work. It doesn't really matter all that much. That's important, I think, for us to remember because we love that Elixir is oh, it's all concurrent and stuff. And it's yeah, we are cool. But other people are cool too. And they also are making their things work. And then this goes for all your things, right? It's like you can pick XYZ technology thing. You can be like, well, I have types and you can't make a thing without types that works. And it's well, that's demonstrably not true. So I don't know where you got your facts. Similarly, you can be like, well, I've never had types and they're useless. And it's well, that's also clearly not true. So at the end of all this, you have to learn how to play ball. It's more important that you get along with your team and enjoy working together. All right. Don't fail at step 0. Now this one's an important, very important one, because if you get this wrong, you literally fail at step 0. You get all of it wrong. So when you're starting to tackle these bigger problems, there's a set of steps that I would like to provide to you that I think about when I'm going through, okay, how are we going to actually tackle this big thing? Because I really don't want to fail before we even get started. So step 1, state the problem. You would be shocked how many people forget this part. State the problem. And when I say state it, I don't mean like in your head. I mean literally out loud, say the problem. Say the problem you're actually trying to solve. And say it to somebody who can tell you, no, you're wrong. That's not what I said. You gotta do this part. If you don't do this part, how do you even know if you did the thing you needed to do? So you state the problem out loud. And then you do a galaxy brain thinking thing and you go, can we find a way to not solve this problem? And that might mean, this doesn't mean I'm bored and that doesn't sound fun, by the way, just in case anybody's like confused. I know none of you are. This is for the audience on YouTube later. It means, is there a way to rethink what we're doing such that we don't have to solve this problem? It means doing that higher order meta thinking of like, can we just like get around this? Can we make it so that we don't need ACID transactions on this? Because boy, would that make our lives easier. Can we like, what if we just connected that sensor directly to that thing instead of going through a BeagleBone over an Ethernet thing, over a whatever? Like, can we find a higher order thinking? This actually is hard for some people. And I get it. Solving problems is just fun sometimes. Like I like Sudoku, I get it. But getting out of that mindset and being willing to be like, well, I'm gonna put aside the fun thing that sounds cool so that we can just make the simpler thing is important. Then you do some research. Especially if it's a big problem you've never done before, you go around, you do your research, you read some papers, you read a book, you read a blog, you watch a YouTube video, you talk to some friends who are knowledgeable, you ask around, figure out what other things are in the space like that. Like, what are we gonna maybe have to solve? Maybe I go get an expert, right? You do your due diligence, like go figure it out. And if like you're doing tickets and they got points and whatever, you make a ticket that's like to satisfy your product manager that says, I'm gonna do some research, and you make it a chore or whatever and Pivotal and you move it on. So you go off and do some research. And then when you're done with all of that, you come back and you gather your solutions together, and we'll talk about that. This is something that we actually did start adopting at my current company. It's actually been super great, and I want to talk a little bit about our process for that, about how we sort of analyze the potential solutions that we have for a given problem. Because ideally, you don't come up with one solution. There's never just one solution. You get all the solutions, or at least a plurality of solutions, enough to feel good. And we do this in a process that we refer to as a decision matrix. This is not my idea. We stole this with reckless abandon from Rich Hickey. I have a link to the talk specifically here in a bit. This is all from him. We take no credit for this. And you would go through this process called a decision matrix. And I say we because this is fun for the whole team. And in fact, I will go out and say, in general, you always want to do this with someone else. You really don't ever want to do this by yourself because you are blind to certain things, and also because it engenders more psychological safety on your team if everybody's bought in on the decision-making process. So you're going to want to go through this with the whole team. What we do is we open Google Sheets. If you like Airtable, you could use that crap. You do whatever. Pick your thing. Doesn't matter. And in A1, in the very first thing, we state the problem. I cannot emphasize how important this is. We state the problem. And then along the rows, we write all the constraints that we have, right? And these are anything that we want to say. If we're dealing with technical constraints, we write those in here. If we're dealing with things like we need to have this done in the next week or two, we will write that in there. All of the constraints go in here. Anything that could affect the solution is documented, and typically stack ranked in order of importance. And so sometimes your timeline is down there at the bottom because you got 6 months to figure out a thing, and sometimes it's right up there at the top because you got to get it done. And then along the top, we put all of our possible solutions, right? And you start with the most obvious thing or just the first one that you think of, and you start filling in, as objective as one can, how that solution satisfies that constraint. Sometimes it doesn't, and you say it doesn't, and you move on. Sometimes it does via some other mechanism, and you write it all out, and you, again, really try hard to be objective. Again, why this is best done at least with 2 people on your team. Actually, 2 to 3 is about right in general. When you're done doing all that, with all the solutions that you're coming up with, you will then go through, and what we do is we actually color grade these. And we just use a general red to green, sort of good to bad, kind of ratio. And so it's like, oh, well, solution 1 really doesn't solve constraint 1, or it solves it in a really pretty crappy way. Solution 2 solves constraint 2 and 3 in a reasonable way, but not great. You start to just fill this stuff out. And this gets to be subjective. You're allowed to be subjective in this part, because now you're working together as a team to work out what you're actually going to do. And you're going to try to work out something that sort of satisfies it. Now, along with this is not a closed loop here. Once we've done this for the stuff that we're thinking about, you keep writing more solutions. You keep going. You don't stop at the 3 you came up with at the start. You're like, oh, wait a minute. No, if we took this idea from this thing and this idea from the next thing, we could actually do solution 4, and that actually gets us into a better place. I tell you what, by the time you get, let's go ahead and say 6 or 7 columns down, now you're starting to find something interesting. You're like, oh, I think now we might be on to something. This is like actually the best of all the worlds. That's where the juice is, way down there. But you got to do this part of the process. Like, you got to talk it out, because maybe you missed something. So this is iterative, it's living. Sometimes these will take days, and we will just take the days it takes to go through them. Sometimes it's a day. Then, when you're done with that, you give it at least 8 hours before you open your editor of choice. You sleep, if you sleep for 8 hours. Go take a walk, right? Really don't jump into code immediately. Let it sit. In general, you have more time than you think. And just let it sit for a little bit before you just rush in. And then finally, you can go back and actually start to work on it and start to try to work out how you're going to go through the nuts and bolts of the code part. Like I said, we stole all of this from Rich Hickey. The talk title you're looking for is Design in Practice. Go find it, go watch it. It's great. It's been very, very, very useful. And in general helps us to not fail at step 0 before we even get started writing code. All right. It's not done when it's done, which is a contradiction of terms, obviously. But I like to say things like that because I find them funny. And where this really comes from is an old adage. I originally heard this from other mechanical engineers. But it turns out it's a quote. And it comes from this. It's perfection is achieved not when there is nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. And I think that's really lovely. I just thought I would share that with you. But I think this is very, very interesting to me as an aesthetic. And it reminds me a little bit of this book. Has anybody read this book? This is a great book. Highly recommend you go through it. I'm going to draw conclusions from this book that the book does not make. So I hope you'll tolerate. Anybody who's read it is going to notice pretty quickly that he's making claims that are not in the book. But I think that I would like to think that there's an aesthetic that's shared in between those things, in between something I'm going to say about this. And hopefully you'll indulge me a little bit. Because I think there's a shared aesthetic in how I think about software design. When I'm thinking about software design, part of what we're trying to achieve is not just, did we get the problem solved? There's also the meta problem of, did we need to solve it in the first place? Which is part of the inherent thing. And there's also this other part of like, but did I actually achieve it in a way that is useful and good and right? Where right isn't morally right, but is you just feel it. The gestalt of it's right. Like something about the use of it is right. Feels good. I think about this in terms of did I actually solve the problem, right? That's number one. And it's always good to check. But is it useful for other people? Do other people get anything out of this? Do they get joy when they use it in a, Marie Kondo sense? Do they get to use the API and they sort of they understand it, it's easy for them? Or am I getting a bunch of pushback because it's a pain to actually use the thing? Nobody actually really wants to engage with it because it sucks. But it does what it says. It solved the problem. Yeah, but it sucks. It's oh, there's an aesthetic quality that matters here. But I also think about this in terms of is the validations that we put in place, is the things that we did around it sufficient to guarantee that or at least give us some confidence that we really did solve this in a robust way for lots of people, for lots of things. All right. Next principle, we want to cultivate complexity, which is an interesting choice of words because cultivation means to grow, it means to grow intentionally. We're actually going to cultivate like vegetables, right? You're protecting them, you're gathering them up, and you're creating a space for them to grow and to flourish. That seems weird. We don't want to do that with complexity, right? But the reality is that complexity lives somewhere. It is somewhere. And I don't think we like to acknowledge this all the time. I think we like to believe that we can hide complexity or rather push it off onto something else and it goes away. We're done with it. We never have to think about it again. And this mostly manifests in this sort of build versus buy conversation that comes up a lot, where buy doesn't necessarily just actually spend money, although that can definitely mean that, especially if you're using AWS and they just put your credit card in there and they charge you however much you want. It can also mean using a library or adopting a technology or whatever. There's this big conversation, and I think people's can skew one way or the other. But when we think about buying, it's well, we didn't eliminate that complexity from the system. It just lives in a library now. It's still there. It's just somebody else owns it. It's somebody else's problem. If I go and use Amazon and I throw myself in Amazon East, well, I'm just at whatever, if somebody LS's the wrong directory again, it's just all going to go down. Symlinks are hard. I forget the arguments to symlinks too. No shade, whatever. I get it. I never took down Amazon East, but that guy did. But when I think this is why I love to think about it in terms of cultivation, because sometimes you want to do that. Sometimes it's cool to push that complexity to somebody else, make somebody else's problem. But for everything that's not, it's sort of going to be our responsibility to take ownership of it. And either way, we're making a choice. We have to go into that very clear-eyed. And so part of our cultivation is creating a space for that complexity to grow and for us to manage it. We want to be able to manage it. If you give it all away, you can't manage anything, and then you're at the whims of the guy who LS's the wrong directory in AWS East. The other really complicated thing about this is that Complexity and building versus buying is completely situational. There are no rules for this. And it's going to be completely dependent on what your company is doing. Most companies don't ever need to build network switches. And I'm in conversations currently, unironically, talking about building a network switch. And I actually contend that that makes sense. There are going to be times where you're going to do things that feel like you're adopting sort of like a ridiculous sort of burden, but it might make sense for you. So there's no good like one size fits all thing you can do here. And anybody who acts like there hasn't actually had to do this before, let's say. So I'd love to give you a rubric, but I don't have one. Instead, what I try to think about, and I don't know if this actually really satisfies the problem, but these are just things that bounce through my head when I think about this stuff, is what's the risk? Both in terms of us owning this and us not owning this, right? What's the risk that we can't manage this? What's the risk that we can't change it or that we get compromised in some way because of it? Does it have a literal safety risk for not owning this? These are all things I genuinely try to think about. Is what we're doing truly generic? Sometimes it is. Actually, a lot of times it is. And then sometimes it's very not. Or there's pieces of it that aren't. Or maybe you need a smaller component. You don't need, oh my God, I just blanked on the name of it. Christopher Micklejohn's entire thing, not just partisan, but the whole thing. Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, you don't need LASP, you need partisan, or you need consistent hashing, right? There's different, you have to think about your different parts of your problem. And also, how much burden is this going to introduce? Is it very, very complicated for all of us to manage it, to interact with it, to run it? And what are the costs associated with that? And you really, really, really got to be honest with yourself here. Sometimes you just got to take on the complexity. And sometimes you don't. And sometimes it doesn't sound as fun to not do the consistent hashing part. There isn't really a rubric. Okay. Embracing suffering. Okay, so I mentioned I'm a runner. I'm currently trying to run that many miles at the end of the year. And one of the sort of refrains that comes up when I tell people this is, for people who've done marathon running before, is, well, get ready to embrace suffering. And I tell them, oh, I did open source for several years. You have no idea how much I hate myself. The depths of my depravity go low. I think I love this quote. So do you all know who this is? Penn and Teller. Don't always agree with them ideologically, but I also kind of love them. Penn has this great quote, and I think about this all the time, is he said the secret to every great magic trick, at some point in the trick, there's a moment where the audience thinks to themselves, wow, to fake that, it would take someone like 10,000 hours and hundreds of thousands of repetitions in front of a mirror to just perfect that one single weird little movement so that you could be executed flawlessly right in front of us, and then we never know. And the audience member correctly comes to the conclusion that no reasonable person would spend that much time doing that. And his response was, and they've never met magicians before. And I would say, or programmers. There's something to this idea of like, just putting the time in, being willing to run in the rain, being willing to get up at 6 and run in the cold when you don't want to, sucks. So you just embrace suffering a little bit. You just do the work because it's the work that needs to be done. You just get in there and just do it. And this, I think, is really important because a lot of times what you're volunteering for is to embrace suffering so other people don't have to. so other people can like build off of that lever that you're establishing. And so what I would encourage you to do here is like, sometimes you just got to roll up your sleeves and do your taxes. Like, you just got to do the work that no one else wants to do. There's 10,000 open Jira tickets and no one knows where they all are. Well, time to print them all out, categorize them on the floor for the next couple days, and when people show back up again, it'll just be done. It'll be fixed. Don't shy away from the work if that is the thing that has to be done. This also means don't shy away from hard problems. Embrace those. Those are your opportunities. And finally, you're not wrong, Walter. Getting good at communication is a major part of this job. This is a late edition. I added this morning because of conversations that I've had here with people this weekend that have like really made me think more about this. And I just think this is really important stuff. If you start to take on a leadership role in your company or anywhere, really, it's really important to understand your reputation or understand the weight that your words carry. Understand what it is that when you say things, how others might interpret them. Because when your words start to carry more weight, just because you're a well-liked person or a well-respected person or a well-known person or a manager or whatever the case may be, just a senior person in your organization or in your team or in your life, your words hold different weight. And so when you say things, you can say things that you never meant to come out being overly critical or harsh or mean, but simply because you hold a position of authority, they feel that way. You have to be careful with the words that you use. You can't really change how people interpret your words. You can obviously be careful and try to structure what you want to say, but miscommunications just happen, and you can't control that. You do get to control the words you use and how you say them and how you put them out in there into the world. And they have meaning and they matter. And I would say at the end of the day, all of us really just want to do interesting work and live our lives and be happy and enjoy the teams we're working on. And because of that, I think this stuff really matters. So those are the things I think about. I don't know if these are the right things to think about or the best things to think about or useful to anybody besides me. But I hope that some of these might prove useful to y'all. And last, just in case no one else says it today, you're all doing great and you're all awesome.